Contrast leadership and power. So, in organizational behavior, power refers to a capacity that A has to influence the behavior of B, so B acts in accordance with A's wishes. Someone can thus have power but not use it. It is a capacity or a potential. But probably the most important aspect of power is that it is a function of dependence.
13.2 Basis of power. The first basis of power is formal power, which is based on an individual's position in an organization. It is then split into three. First is coercive power. It depends on the target's fear of negative results from failing to comply. The second one is reward power. It is opposite of coercive power because people comply because it produces positive benefits for them. The third one is legitimate power. It refers to the formal authority to control and use organizational resources based on a person's structural position in the organization. This is broader than the power of coerce and reward. The second type of power is called personal power. This comes from an individual's unique characteristics. The first one is expert power. Is it influence rooted as a result from expertise, special skills, or knowledge? This can come from experience and etc. And the second one is referent power. It's based on identification of the person who has desirable resources or personal traits, which people like.
Dependence, the key to power. Dependency is a relationship formed between two people when one of them has something that other requires. When we possess anything that other require that we alone control, we can make them dependent on us, and therefore we can gain power over them. Dependency then is inversely proportional to the alternative source of supply. If something is plentiful, possession of it will not increase power. It may also explain why many people aspire to be independent, since independence reduces the power of others can will to limit our access and opportunity. So what creates dependence? The first one is importance. The occurrence of being crucially significant or valuable. Therefore, things we control must be regarded as significant in order to generate dependency. Scarcity is a state where resources are insufficient. Then, to build dependency, our resources must be few as scarce. The power of job categories demonstrate the scarcity-dependency relationship. Individual in job where supply of individual is limited compared to the demand may negotiate more appealing wage and also benefit packages than those in job where there is an overflow of applicants. The third one is non-substitutability. Those in which there are no strategic equivalent. The more power control over a resources provide, the less suitable substitute there are. For example, Saudi Arabia, as one of the top producer of fossil fuel, decided to lower its fossil fuel production, causing the resources to become scarce and the demand to rise. As the result, they will have a lot of power over other nations. Next, we're gonna discuss the social network analysis. It is one of the tools for evaluating the flow of resources and dependency inside the company. This strategy looks at how individuals of an organization communicate in order to figure out how information moves between them. Each individual or group inside a social network or relationship between people who share professional interests is referred to as a node, and the connection between nodes are referred as ties. Nodes are considered to have strong links when they communicate and transfer resources frequently. Sociogram, as you can see from the picture, is a graphical representation of the relationship between members in a social network. The sociogram can be used by certain companies to maintain track of the flow of, for example, email exchange or document sharing among departments. Leaders then may use these data tools to identify influential brokers who have the most influence over a variety of groups and address them.
So next thing to be discussed is regarding to power tactics. So what are power tactics? Power tactics are ways in which individuals translate power bases in specific actions. So research has identified 9 distinct influence tactics. The first one is legitimacy. Legitimacy means relying on your authority position or saying a request accords with organizational policies or rules. Next, there is rational persuasion. It is presenting logical arguments and factual evidence to demonstrate a request is reasonable. And the third one is inspirational appeals, or developing emotional commitment by appealing to a target's values, needs, hopes, and aspirations. And the next one is consultation, in which it is increasing support by involving the target in deciding how to accomplish your plan. And next is exchange, is rewarding to the target with benefits for favors and exchange for acceding to a request. There's also personal appeals, that is asking for compliance based on friendship or loyalty. And next, ingratiation, that is using flattery, praise, or friendly behavior prior to making a request. Next, pressure, which is using warnings, repeated demands, and threats. And last but not least, we have coalitions, which means enlisting the aid or support of others to persuade the target to agree. Actually, every tactic will be effective in different situations. Like, for example, rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, or consultation tend to be the most effective, especially when the audience is highly interested in the outcomes of a decision process. In the next slide, we will discuss further regarding to the use of power tactics. Okay, so next, we will discuss more further regarding to the use of power tactics. So the effectiveness of some influence tactics depends on the direction of influence and the audience. Some tactics might be more effective than others, and you can also increase your chance of success by using 2 or more tactics together or sequentially, as long as your choice is compatible. There's a term softer tactics. It is more likely to be effective if you begin with something that rely on personal power, such as personal and inspirational appeals. And if the softer tactics is fail, you can move to harder tactics, or like exchange, coalitions, and pressure, which emphasize formal power and incur greater costs and risks. Okay, so still in regards to the use of power tactics, here we're going to talk about cultural preferences for power tactics. As I mentioned before, that every tactics will be effective in different situations. It also applies in the terms of cultural. Preference for power tactics varies across cultures, and for example, those from individuals' countries tend to see power in personalized terms and as a legitimate means of advancing their personal ends, where those in collectivist countries see power in social terms and as a legitimate means of helping others. Another example, a study comparing managers in the United States and China found that most of US managers prefer rational appeal, whereas Chinese managers prefer coalition tactics. Reason-based tactics are consistent with the US preference for direct confrontation and rational persuasion to influence others and resolve differences, while coalition tactics align with the Chinese preference for meeting difficult or controversial requests with indirect approaches. And next, there is applying power tactics. So people differ in their political skill, or if you haven't familiar with the word political skill is someone's ability to influence others to enhance their own objectives. And political skill is more effective when the stakes are high, like board of directors. And finally, the political skill are also able to exert their influence without others detecting it. Individuals are also able to use their political skills in environments with low levels of procedural and distributive justice.
So we're going to move on to the next sub-chapter, which is 13.5, which talks about how power affects people. So first is that power leads people to place their own interests ahead of others' needs and goals. So power also appears to lead individuals to objectify others, to see them as tools to obtain their instrumental goals, and to see relationships as more peripheral. So those given powers are more likely to make self-interested decisions when faced with moral hazards. So power variables. So power does appear to have some important disturbing effects on us. However, there are even positive effects of power on us. So first is that researchers says that the toxic effects of power depend on the wielder's personality, which
If we have an anxious personality, power does corrupt us because we are less likely to think that using power benefit us. While for the corrosive effect of power can be contained by an organizational system. And for the last one is that simply expressing gratitude towards powerful others make them less likely to act aggressively on us. So these are the positive traits of power, which are first, power energizes and increases motivations to achieve goals. And the second one is that it enhances our motivation to help others. And the last one is that power led to self-interested behavior. So we now talk about sexual harassment in the workplace. So what exactly is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment is defined as any unwanted activity of a sexual nature that affects on an individual's employment or creates a hostile work environment. So again, most studies confirm that power is central to understanding sexual harassment. This seems true whether the harassment comes from a supervisor, coworker, or employee. And sexual harassment is more likely to occur when there are a large power differential. So for example, it's like from a director to someone who's like from below, just because power makes them feel powerful. Okay, so when there's actually sexual harassment in the workplace, there are certain things that the managerial has to do. So first is to make sure an active policy defining what constitutes sexual harassment informs employee that they can be fired for inappropriate behavior. Second is to reassure employees they will not encounter retaliation if they file a complaint. And third is to investigate every complaint and inform the legal and HR department. The fourth one is to make sure offenders are disciplined and terminated. And the fifth one is set up an in-house seminars to raise employees' awareness of sexual harassment issues.
How politics work in organization. There is no shortage of definitions of organizational politics. Essentially, this type of politics focuses on the use of power to affect decision-making in an organization, sometimes for self-serving and organizationally unsanctioned behaviors. For our purposes, politic behavior in organizations consists of activities that are not required as part of an individual's formal role, but that influence or attempt to influence the distribution of advantages and disadvantages within the organization.
13.7 Causes and consequences of political behavior. The first one is factors contributing to political behavior. First is the individual factors. This can come from certain personal traits, needs, and other factors likely to be related to political behavior. For examples are people who are high self monitors, then people with desire for power, people who has a big investment in the organization, and then people with high expectations of success. And that's why those are the factors that may lead to people doing political behaviors. The second factor contributing to political behavior is organizational factor. This can come from when resources are reduced, which then would lead to political actions to safeguard what they have. Any changes like significant reallocation of resources may stimulate conflict and increase politicking.
A definition of conflict. Conflict is a process that begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. So there are two types of conflict. The first one is functional conflict. It's a conflict that supports the goal of the group and improves its performance. On the other hand, dysfunctional conflict is a conflict that hinders group performance. So there are three types of conflict. The first one we have task conflict, which is conflict over content and goals of the work. Second one is relationship conflict, a conflict based on interpersonal relationship. And lastly, process conflict is a conflict over how work gets done. Loci of conflict. The first one we have dyadic conflict, which is conflict that occurs between two people. The second one we have intragroup conflict, a conflict that occurs within a group or a team. And lastly, intergroup conflict, conflict between different groups or teams.
14.2, the conflict process. The five stages of conflict processes are: stage one, potential oppositions or incompatibility. This is the cause or effect, which are the communication, structure, and personal variables. The stage two is cognition and personalization. This is where the conflict issue tend to be defined and decided what the conflict is about. Stage three is intentions. Intentions intervene between people's perception and their own behavior. Stage four is behavior, which includes statements, actions, and reactions made by confliction parties. Stage five are outcomes. Outcomes are the action reaction interplay between conflicting parties that create consequences for both parties.
Negotiation is an activity in which two or more parties trade goods or services and find an agreement on a rate of exchange. There are a few bargaining strategies. The first one is distributive bargaining. It is a negotiation that aims at dividing a fixed amount of resources. Negotiating about who receives what part of fixed pie is the essence of distributive bargaining. Fixed pie itself is the assumption that there is only a fixed quantity of product or services that need to be distributed between the parties. One of example of distributive bargaining is the purchase of a car. A car transaction comprised of two parties, which are the buyer and also the seller. Each party has a distinct goal in the situation. The seller wants to make as money as possible, whereas the buyer wants to pay as little as possible. The picture on the side depicts the core distributive bargaining. Two negotiators are represented as the parties A and B. Each has a goal in mind that outlines what he or she wants to accomplish. Each has a resistance point, which denote the lowest acceptance result, the point at which the side will stop negotiating rather than accept a less advantageous settlement. Each party ambition range is the area between these 2 points. There is a settlement range in which of A's and B's ambition may be realized as long as there is some overlap between their aspiration range. Other strategy is integrative bargaining. It is a negotiation in which one or more settlements are negotiated in a win-win scenario. Integrative bargaining assumes that both parties must feel as if they gave up an equal amount or sacrificed equally in order to reach an agreement. Integrative bargaining is often less tense since both parties approach the discussion unwilling to compromise in order to reach a consensus. For example, there are a marketing and information technology department which are debating what information they want to give at the presentation. However, because they only have limited time amount, they can only discuss a few things. Therefore, they discuss together and make notes of all the talking points for each department before deciding to merge them. As a result, the presentation consists of the marketing effort also from the information technology division. Therefore, both of them have a win-win solution. Here, there are some comparison between the distributive and also integrative bargaining. The goal of distributive bargaining is to get as much of the fixed pie as possible, whereas in integrative bargaining, the goal is to expand the pie so that both parties are satisfied. The motivation of distributive bargaining is win and lose, whereas the integrative bargaining is win-win. The focus of distributive bargaining is position, whereas integrative bargaining is interest. The interest of distributive bargaining is opposed, whereas the integrative bargaining is congruent. And the information sharing in the distributive bargaining is low, because sharing information will only allow other party to take advantage. Whereas in the integrative bargaining, the information sharing is high, because sharing information will allow other parties to find a way to satisfy both interests. And duration of relationship for distributive bargaining is only for short term, whereas for integrative bargaining is for long term.
Okay, so now moving on to the negotiation process. The first step is preparation and planning. So before you start negotiating, there are several things you need to prepare to have a great negotiation. In negotiating, you have to consider things like what's the nature of the conflict, what's the history leading up to this negotiation, who's involved and what are their perception of the conflict, what do you want from the negotiation, as you should also assess what you think are the other party's goals. Not only considering yours, you also have to consider the other party perspective. And when negotiating, you are better equipped to counter arguments with facts and figures that support your position. You also have to behave and decide carefully in every words or act you do in negotiate, because your relationships might change as the result, which can be either good or bad. Not only gather information and prepare in case of wording, you also have to determine you and your other party's best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or we call it BATNA, in which you determine the lowest value acceptable for both parties related. And the next step is definition of ground rules. After planning and preparing a strategy, next thing to do is ground rules and procedures of the negotiation itself. The questions such who will do the negotiating, where will it take place, what time constraints, if any, will apply, to what issues will negotiation be limited, will you follow a specific procedure if an impasse is reached. During this phase, the parties will exchange their initial proposals or demands. And the next step is clarification and justification. So when you have exchanged initial positions, you and the other party will explain, amplify, clarify, bolster, and justify your original demands. It's an opportunity for educating each other on the issues, why they are important, and how you arrived at your initial demands. Provide the other party with any documentation that supports your position is actually in this phase. And the next step is bargaining and problem solving. So the essence of negotiating process is the actual give and take in trying to hash out an agreement. So this step is where both parties need to make concessions. And the last step is closure and implementation, where the negotiation process is like formalizing your agreement for major negotiations, from labor management negotiations to bargaining over lease terms. This requires hammering out of the specifics informal contract, or for other case, it's like a handshake.
So, talking about negotiation, this brings us to the 4 factors that influence how individuals negotiate. So, the first one is personality, mood or emotions, culture, and gender differences. So, personality in negotiations. So, it appears that the degree of which agreeableness and personality more generally affects negotiations outcomes depends on the situation. So the importance of being extroverted in negotiations, for example, will very much depend on how the other party reacts to someone who is assertive and enthusiastic. So the next one is mood or emotions in negotiations. So a negotiator who shows anger can induce concessions. So it also appears that having a history of showing anger rather than showing the seeds of revenge actually induces more concessions, because the other party perceives the negotiator as tough. While another relevant emotion is disappointment. Generally, a negotiator who perceives disappointment from his or her counterpart concedes more. So anxiety also appears to have an impact on negotiation. Is that individuals who experience from anxiety about a negotiation use more deceptions in dealing with others. So culture. So people generally negotiate more effectively within cultures than between them. What does this actually mean? So it means that for an Indonesian, it is better to negotiate with another Indonesian than with someone who's a foreigner. So it appears that in cross-cultural negotiations, it is especially important that the negotiators is high in openness. So this suggests a good strategy in to choose cross-cultural negotiators who are high on openness to experience and to avoid factors such as time pressure that tend to inhibit learning about the other party. So negotiators then need to be especially aware of the emotional dynamics in cross-cultural negotiation. So the last one that we're going to talk about is gender differences in negotiations. So a popular stereotype is that women are more cooperative and pleasant in negotiations than men. So men tend to place a higher value on status, power, and recognition. So whereas women tend to place a higher value on compassion and altruism. So women do tend to value relationships outcomes more than men, and men tend to value economic outcomes more than women. So compared to men, women tend to behave in a less assertive and less self-interested and more accommodating manner.
To truly comprehend negotiation in practice, we must take into account social factors such as reputation and relationship. Reputation is the way other people think and talk about us. Therefore, when it's come to negotiating, having a trustworthy reputation is important. There are a few characteristics that may help a person develop a trustworthy reputation. The first one is honest. Others will feel more comfortable giving open-ended offer with many alternative outcomes if we behave honestly in repeated interaction. Both parties can attempt to achieve what is most important to them while also benefiting the other party if they are transparent. The next one is competence. Negotiators with high level of self-confidence and also cognitive ability are perceived as more competent by their partner. They are also considered better able to accurately describe a situation and more credible when they make suggestions. The last one is integrity. Individuals with a reputation for integrity are seen to be more likely to keep their promise, as well as provide accurate information. Therefore, as a result, the partner or the opponent are willing to take their promises as a negotiating tactic. Repeated negotiation can help with integrative problem solving because individuals get to know their negotiating partner better over time and form emotional bonds with them. A good negotiator must consider more than simply outcome of a particular interaction. In the long term, negotiators who continuously behave with competence, honesty, and integrity will likely to have better outcome in relationship. Individual or group representative, on the other hand, may reach a stalemate, which they are unable to settle their disagreement through direct discussion. In this condition, they may seek assistance from a third party to find a solution. The first one is mediator. Mediator is a neutral third party who uses reasoning, persuasion, and alternative suggestion to facilitate a negotiated settlement. They act as facilitator that assists in arriving an agreement. A mediator is more a facilitator who assists in developing options and achieving mutually agreed resolution. They facilitate dialogue between the two parties, and it is up to them to come up to an agreement. They are usually used to settle a minor dispute or when the confidentiality of the issue is required. Mediation is frequently viewed as an acceptable conflict resolution technique in instances when the parties have an ongoing relationship, as a means of avoiding the kind of harm that the regular court system may create. Arbitrator is a third party who has the right to dictate an agreement. An arbitrator is a judge of the dispute and provides resolution measures which are binding on the parties. An arbitrator acts more like a judge, deciding the result of a disagreement based on facts and law given in arbitration so that the decision may be enforced in the same way that court order can. An arbitrator gains importance in major conflicts or a specialized area of expertise is necessary. The last one is conciliator. Conciliator is a trustworthy third person who acts as a bridge for informal communication between the negotiator and the opposing side. As facilitator, evaluator, and intervener that is appointed to settle the dispute by persuading parties to reach agreement. When a party wants to handle legal situation outside the courtroom, with a third party having more active role, they will choose a conciliator rather than a mediator. To sum up, both in mediation and conciliation, two parties are required to solve the dispute and come to a resolution on their own. A mediator is only present but they can only mediate the discussion to ensure fairness for both parties. In contrast, conciliator is a method where the two parties dispute an issue and have the potential to come out with their own solution, but the conciliator interject potential solution to them. Both conciliation and arbitration involve two parties resolving a dispute with the input or suggestion of a third party. Conciliator can provide input and potentially propose resolution, but they cannot force parties to comply with a particular solution as arbitrator can. And that brings us to the end. We'd like to thank you for your time and attention. If anyone has any question, please feel free to ask.